The happiest day of their son turned into Nyla's greatest humiliation. The entire church fell silent when Omari took the baby from her arms and placed him in his mistress's lap. Then he looked at Nyla and said, "You don't deserve to sit with my family." The congregation waited for her to break down. Instead, she smiled, touched the cross around her neck, and quietly whispered, "Thank you." Even the priest paused before continuing, because only she knew whose christening this really was. The church was called St. Augustine's, an old stone building on the east side of the city, with tall stained glass windows that turned the morning sun into color across the floor. It was beautiful. Nyla had chosen it herself. She had paid for the flowers, the white ribbon on every pew, the small silver bowls of water, the choir, every single thing that made that room glow she had arranged. Nobody knew that yet. They would soon. Baby Elijah wore a white christening gown that had been in Nyla's family for 3 generations. He was 6 months old, with fat cheeks and his mother's calm eyes, and he slept against her chest while the guests filled the pews. Omari's business partners came in their good suits. His cousins, his mother, Miss Odessa, in a wide church hat, sitting up front like a queen, and near the back, in a red dress that did not belong at a christening, sat Simone. Everybody knew who Simone was. That was the cruelty of it. Omari had stopped hiding her months ago. He brought her to dinners, he let her ride in the front seat, and now he had brought her here to his son's holy day and dressed her in red so no one could miss her. Nyla saw all of it. She saw and she said nothing. She just held her son and touched her small gold cross at her throat, the way she always did when she needed to stay steady. That cross had belonged to her mother. On her mother's last night alive, she had pressed it into Nyla's hand and said 4 words, "Truth outlives noise." Nyla had never forgotten them. She was about to prove them. The ceremony had barely begun when Omari stood up. He walked over to his wife in front of everyone, and he reached down and lifted Elijah right out of her arms. Nyla's hand stayed open in the air for a second where her son used to be. Omari carried the baby across the aisle and placed him in Simone's lap, and Simone, that woman in red, looked straight at Nyla, and she smiled. Not a nervous smile, a slow one, the smile of a woman who thought she had already won. "Move to the back," Omari told his wife, loud enough for the whole church to hear. "You've had your time up here. This is my family now." You could feel the room stop breathing. Then he said the thing that made grown men look at their shoes. He looked at the mother of his child and he said, "You never brought anything to my life. Anyway, you were boring, you were plain. A man like me needs a woman with fire, not a tired housewife who talks about grocery lists." He gestured at Simone like he was showing off a new car. "You don't deserve to sit with my family." Somewhere in the pews a woman gasped. An old deacon shook his head. Miss Odessa, his own mother, did not defend Nyla. She lifted her chin and looked away, like her daughter-in-law was something spilled on the floor. And that was its own kind of knife, because Nyla had spent 2 years of her life nursing that woman through her sickness, feeding her, bathing her, sitting up nights with her. 2 years, and now Odessa turned her face away like a stranger. Everyone waited for Nyla to crumble, to cry, to scream, to beg him not to do this in the house of God. She did none of it. She rose from the pew, slow and calm, smoothed the front of her dress, and she smiled that smile. She touched her cross, and she said, soft as anything, "Thank you, Omari." Then she walked to the back of the church and sat down by herself, straight-backed, hands folded, watching the front like a woman watching a stage. Father Nathaniel, the old priest, looked at her a long moment. Something passed between them that no one else caught. Then he cleared his throat and went on with the ceremony, but his hands were not quite steady on the Bible, because Father Nathaniel was the only other person in that building who knew what was folded inside the envelope in his robe. Nyla had given it to him 2 weeks before, and she had told him one thing: do not open it until you see me touch my cross a second time. Now, let me tell you how these two people got here, because you cannot understand the ending until you understand the beginning. Nyla met Omari 8 years back when neither of them had a dime. She was working 2 jobs and studying accounting at night. He was a big talker with big dreams and empty pockets, but he made her laugh, and back then his eyes went soft when he looked at her. She believed in him when no bank would. When he wanted to start his construction company, it was Nyla who did the math, Nyla who kept the books, Nyla who told him which jobs to take and which to walk away from. She was the quiet engine under everything he built. He used to say it himself, back when he still told the truth. "This woman is my backbone," he'd say at dinners. "I'm nothing without her." They got married in a small church with 40 guests and a cake her aunt baked. Her mother was still alive then, and she gave Nyla that gold cross at the wedding and whispered the same 4 words: "Truth outlives noise." Nyla wore it every day after. For a while they were happy. The company grew, the money came, they moved into a big house with a white porch. And that is usually where these stories turn, isn't it? Because money has a way of showing you who a man really is. The first sign was small: a phone turned face down at dinner, then late nights that ran later, then a new smell in his car, a perfume that wasn't hers. Nyla noticed. She always noticed. But she was raised by a woman who taught her that a smart woman watches before she speaks. So she watched. The change in how he treated her came slow, then all at once. There was a dinner party at the house that spring, a room full of Omari's new important friends. And Nyla remembers it because it was the first time he cut her in public. She had spent all day cooking. She brought out the food, proud of it, and one of the guests complimented the meal. And Omari laughed and said, "That's about all she's good for these days, cooking and cleaning. She used to have a brain, but marriage made her soft." The table laughed with him. They thought it was a joke. Nyla stood there with the serving dish in her hands and felt her face go hot, and she smiled through it. And later that night she washed every plate alone in the kitchen while the laughter carried in from the other room. That was the first cut. It would not be the last. A man does not humiliate a woman in a church out of nowhere. He practices first, in smaller rooms, where he learns that nobody is going to stop him. Then Simone came into the picture. Omari introduced her as a consultant for the business, someone who was going to help them land bigger contracts. Nyla shook the woman's hand and felt the chill right away, the way you feel a draft in a house and know a window is open somewhere. Simone looked at Omari a beat too long, laughed at his jokes a beat too hard, and Nyla filed it away, quiet in the back of her mind, the way she filed everything. Around that same time, Miss Odessa got sick and moved into their home. And here is the part that still stings. Nyla took care of that woman like she was her own blood, cooked her meals soft enough to eat, drove her to every appointment, sat with her through the bad nights when the fever came. Odessa would hold her hand and call her a good girl, a daughter, a blessing, and Nyla believed her. She should not have. because one afternoon, home earlier than expected, Nyla walked toward the kitchen and heard two voices laughing, Odessa's and Simone's, together, in her house. And the moment Nyla's shoe touched the tile, both women went silent, the kind of silent that has guilt in it. Simone smiled that red smile and said she was just leaving. Odessa said they were talking about church. They were not talking about church. Nyla said nothing. She smiled and offered them tea. But that night she lay awake, and a cold understanding began to settle in her chest. The mistress and the mother-in-law laughing together in her kitchen. That was not an affair anymore. That was a plan. Now watch how careful this woman was. Most people, when they suspect, they explode, they confront, they throw the phone across the room and demand answers. And what do they get? A lie, a fight, and a husband who is now more careful. Nyla did the opposite. She got quiet. She got patient. She started paying attention to everything. And what she found over the next few weeks broke her heart twice. It started with the second phone. She found it by accident, taped under the bottom of his desk drawer, the kind of hiding place a guilty man is proud of. She did not scream when she saw the messages. She sat down in his office chair in the dark, and she read every one. Photos, plans, Simone calling Elijah our future, like the baby was a prize she'd win in a divorce. Omari promising her the house, the cars, the life. Nyla read it all with dry eyes and a steady hand, and the whole time her fingers kept finding that little gold cross at her throat. But the messages were not the worst of it. The worst of it was in the numbers, and numbers were Nyla's whole world. She pulled the books, the ones she used to keep, before Omari quietly pushed her out of them and said she should relax and be a mother. And that is when her stomach turned to ice. Money was gone, moved, rerouted into accounts she'd never seen. Loans taken against the business in her name, with her signature on them. A signature she had never signed. Someone had forged her hand, careful and practiced, on document after document. She sat with those papers a long time, and then she noticed something on the edge of one of them, a note in the margin in handwriting she knew as well as her own. Round, old-fashioned letters. Miss Odessa's handwriting. A note coaching Simone on exactly what to say, exactly which papers to sign, exactly how to move Nyla out of the picture without her knowing. That was the second wound, and it went deeper than the first. The husband she could almost understand. Men lose their heads. But the mother she had bathed and fed and sat up with through the night, the woman who called her a daughter, had been holding the pen that wrote her out of her own life. And it got worse before it got better, because a few days after she found the papers, Simone came to the house openly in the middle of the afternoon, like she already lived there. Nyla was folding laundry in the front room when the woman let herself in without knocking. Simone looked her up and down, slow, and said, "You know, I almost feel bad for you. Almost." She ran a finger along the back of the couch like she was deciding whether to keep it. But a woman who can't hold her own husband can't really complain when somebody better comes along. Don't worry, though. When all this is done, I'll make sure the boy remembers you. A little. And she smiled, and she walked out, leaving the front door open behind her so the cold air came in. Now, most women in Nyla's position would have thrown that laundry basket across the room. Most women would have followed her out to the driveway screaming. Nyla did neither. She got up, quiet, and she closed the door, and she stood there with her hand on the wood for a long moment. And if you had been in that room, you would have seen it. She was not defeated, she was deciding. There is a difference, and Simone had just made the worst mistake of her life, because she had confused one for the other. Here is the question I want you to hold on to, because you will not get the answer for a while yet. When Nyla finally stood up from that desk, papers in her lap, betrayal on every side of her, she did not call a lawyer first. She did not call her sister. She got in her car in the middle of the night and she drove to St. Augustine's church, and she asked to speak with Father Nathaniel alone. Nobody knows what she said to that old priest that night. Nobody except him. But she left a sealed envelope in his hands, and she told him, "Do not open this until you see me touch my cross a second time. Remember that. It matters more than anything else in this story." Now, most women in Nyla's position would have filed for divorce right there and taken whatever the court gave her. But Nyla was not most women, and she understood something Omari had forgotten. So she did not run, she prepared. She went to see a lawyer, a sharp, older woman on the other side of town where none of Omari's friends would see her car. She laid all the papers on the table, the forged loans, the moved money, the photos, and the lawyer looked at one particular document, an old one, and she started to smile. Because here is the thing Omari forgot. Years back, when the business was young and a lawsuit was threatening to take everything, it was Nyla who came up with the fix. To protect the company from creditors, they put everything, the house, the accounts, the business itself, into her name. Only her name. "Just on paper, baby," Omari had said, kissing her forehead, not even reading it, "just to keep us safe." And then he forgot all about it, the way a man forgets the woman who saved him once he thinks he doesn't need her. But the paper did not forget, the law did not forget, and neither did Nyla. Legally, Omari owned nothing. Not the house he'd thrown her out of in the front pew, not the cars he let Simone ride in, not the company he was so proud of. All of it, every brick and every dollar, belonged to the boring, plain woman he had just humiliated in the house of God. The lawyer asked her, "So what do you want to do? We can freeze it all tomorrow. Quiet, clean." And Nyla folded her hands and said, "No, not quiet." Because Nyla understood something about men like Omari. Taking his money in a quiet courtroom would hurt his wallet, but it would not touch the thing that mattered most to him, his pride, his reputation, the way people looked at him when he walked into a room. He had humiliated her in public, on purpose, in front of everyone who mattered to him. And so the truth, when it came, was going to arrive the same way. So Nyla did something that must have taken more strength than anything in this whole story. She waited, and she planned. She let Omari believe he had won. She moved to the back bedroom without a word of complaint. When he flaunted Simone, Nyla looked away like a beaten woman. When Odessa ordered her around the house, Nyla said, "Yes, ma'am," and kept her eyes down. And every day the two of them grew bolder, because nothing makes a cruel person more careless than a victim who won't fight back. Meanwhile, in rooms they knew nothing about, Nyla was building. She was the one who offered Elijah's christening. Omari waved his hand and said, "Fine, do something with yourself." He didn't know his wife was choosing the church, paying for every detail, and writing the guest list with the care of a general choosing a battlefield. She invited his business partners. She invited the man from the bank who held those forged loans. And she invited one more guest, someone connected to Simone, someone whose presence in that church would matter very much before the day was done. She DNA tested Elijah, quietly, and put the results in a safe place, not because she doubted, but because she knew that one day a man might stand up in a church and point at the wrong woman. Every piece went into place, slow and silent, and through all of it, the audience of her own life kept expecting her to break. She never did, because she wasn't sad anymore. Somewhere in those long, quiet weeks, the grief had burned down into something harder and cleaner. She wasn't planning revenge. She was planning the truth. There is a difference, and by the end you'll feel it. There were nights it was hard, I won't pretend there weren't. There were nights she sat on the edge of that back bedroom bed, holding the gold cross in her fist so tight it left a mark in her palm, listening to Omari laugh with Simone on the phone down the hall like she wasn't even in the house. There were mornings she cooked breakfast for a man who looked through her like glass. And every one of those mornings she had a choice. She could break or she could build, and she chose to build every single day because she had a son sleeping in the next room, and she was not going to leave that boy a mother who fell apart. She was going to leave him a mother who stood up. So she swallowed it. She smiled. She said, "Yes, ma'am," to Odessa and passed the salt to Simone at her own dinner table. And inside, brick by brick, she kept building the thing that was going to bring the whole house down. Now here is where the ground began to shift in ways so small that only a careful eye would catch them. A week before the christening, one of Omari's business partners, a heavyset man named Reggie, pulled him aside at the office. Reggie had been going over some paperwork for a new contract, and something didn't add up. "Omari," he said, frowning, "why is your wife's name on the deed to the whole operation? On the accounts, too. Everything runs through her." Omari laughed it off. "Old paperwork, man, tax thing, I'll fix it." But that night, for the first time, a small, cold thread of worry worked its way into his chest. He went home and looked for some of the documents. He couldn't find them. Nyla had them. He didn't know that. He just knew that something, somewhere, felt slightly out of his hands. He told himself he was imagining it. He was not imagining it. 2 days before the christening, the man from the bank called the house. Nyla answered, calm as still water, and spoke with him in low tones in the kitchen. When Omari asked who it was, she said, "Wrong number." He believed her because he had stopped seeing her as a person who could do anything to him. That was his mistake. He had made her invisible, and invisible people can move anywhere they want. And Simone, for all her red dress confidence, felt it too. The day before the ceremony, she came by the house to gloat, expecting to see Nyla broken. Instead, she found a woman calmly arranging white flowers, humming to herself, at peace. Simone stood in the doorway and said something sharp, something about how Nyla should enjoy her last few days in this house. And Nyla just looked up at her, smiled that same smile, and said, "I hope you enjoy the christening, Simone. I really do." And for the first time, Simone felt a flicker of something cold, and she covered it with a laugh that was a little too loud, and she left sooner than she meant to. Even Father Nathaniel noticed the change in the air. He greeted Nyla at the church with a quiet respect that he did not show to Omari at all. And the old priest kept touching the envelope inside his robe, the way you touch something you know is going to change lives. And here is the strange thing about a person who has stopped being afraid. Other people can feel it, even when they can't name it. Omari felt it in the way his wife stopped flinching when he raised his voice. Odessa felt it in the way Nyla started looking her dead in the eye when she said, "Yes, ma'am," like the words meant something different now. Simone felt it worst of all because she had built her whole plan on the idea that Nyla was weak, and every day that Nyla did not crack, that idea got a little harder to believe. The night before the christening, Simone couldn't sleep. She told Omari she had a bad feeling. He laughed at her and told her she was being foolish, that his wife was a broken woman who didn't have the spine to do anything but cook and clean. He was so sure. That is the thing about men like Omari. They are always most sure right before they fall. Everybody in that story could feel the storm coming, everyone except the 2 people it was going to land on. And so we come back to that morning, the stained glass, the white ribbons, the baby in the gown, and Omari standing up, taking his son, placing him in Simone's lap, and telling the mother of his child that she was boring and plain and did not deserve to sit with his family. You've seen that part now, but now you know what he didn't. You know the house was hers, the company was hers, the child was hers by blood and law, and you know there was an envelope waiting in the old priest's robe for one small signal. So watch what happens next. Watch it closely. The ceremony went on. Father Nathaniel blessed the water. The choir sang. Omari sat in the front pew with Simone beside him and Elijah in her arms, and he looked back over his shoulder once at Nyla in the back row, and he smirked, actually smirked, enjoying it. And Nyla met his eyes and did not look away. Then came the moment. In that particular christening rite, there is a point where the priest turns to the gathered family and asks the old formal question, the one that has been asked in that church for 100 years. Father Nathaniel closed his eyes for a moment, then he opened them, looked out at the congregation, and asked in his deep, slow voice, "Who is the mother of this child?" It was meant to be a simple, holy question. The mother steps forward, the priest blesses her. That is all. But Omari saw his chance to twist the knife one last time. He stood up proud, in front of every business partner and every cousin and every deacon in that church. He put his hand on Simone's shoulder, and he pointed at her, at the woman in red holding his son, and he said, loud and clear, Simone is Elijah's mother now. She's the woman raising my boy. That one in the back." He flicked his hand toward Nyla like he was shooing a fly. "She is nothing to this family." Simone lifted her chin and smiled out at the crowd like a woman accepting a crown. And that is when Nyla stood up. She did not rush. She did not shout. She rose from the back pew, and the whole church turned to watch her, and she walked slowly down that long center aisle, her heels soft on the stone floor, the only sound in the entire building. Every eye followed her. Omari's smirk started to fade at the edges. Simone's chin came down just a little. Nyla walked all the way to the front, to the baptismal font, and she stopped. She looked at Father Nathaniel, and then, slowly, deliberately, she reached up and unclasped the little gold cross from around her neck, and she set it down gently on the edge of the font. That was the signal. Father Nathaniel reached into his robe, took out the sealed envelope, and opened it. "Omari," Nyla said, and her voice was so calm and so clear it carried to every corner of that stone room. "You asked who the mother of this child is. Let's answer that properly, in front of God, since we're already here." She nodded to the priest, who unfolded the first paper. "That is a certified DNA test and the sealed birth record of Elijah," Nyla said. "It says, in a way no man's pointing finger can change, that I carried him, I bore him, and I am his mother in blood and in law. Simone has held him for 1 hour. I have held him every night of his life." She turned her eyes to Simone. "You are not his mother. You never were, and no amount of red is going to change that." Simone opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The room was silent, that deep, total silence where 200 people are holding their breath at the exact same time. "But you didn't just insult me today, Omari. You've been busy for months." She nodded again, and the priest passed a second set of papers down into the hands of the business partners in the front row. "Those are loan documents taken against our company in my name with my signature." She let that sit. "Except I never signed them. Every one of those signatures is forged. Reggie, you were asking last week why things didn't add up. Now you know." Reggie's face went dark as he flipped through the pages, and the other partners leaned in, and a low, ugly murmur started to move through the pews. Omari's mouth opened. "Nyla." "I'm not finished," she said, still calm, still soft, and somehow that was more powerful than any scream could ever be. "You want to know the funny part? The part God must be laughing at right now?" She looked around the beautiful church. "This building, these flowers, that ribbon on every pew, I paid for all of it. This whole day that you used to humiliate me, I built with my own money, because it's all my money, Omari. It always was." And now she turned and looked directly at him, and she said the words that took the ground right out from under his feet. "The house is in my name. The cars are in my name. The company, every contract, every account, every brick of it is in my name. You signed it over to me 8 years ago to hide it from creditors, and you were too proud to ever read what you signed. You don't own the pew you're sitting in. You never did." She paused. "You told me I brought nothing to your life. Omari, I am the only reason you have a life." You could have heard a candle flicker in that church. For a moment, nobody moved. 200 people sat frozen in those pews, and the only sound was the soft cry of the baby and the slow tick of the old clock on the wall. This was the silence Nyla had been walking toward for months. Not the silence of a woman with nothing to say, the silence of a room that has just realized every single thing it believed was upside down. The boring housewife owned everything, the proud husband owned nothing, the mistress was a liar, and the grandmother was a schemer, and the only person in that church with any dignity left was the woman he had sent to the back row. Omari's face went gray. He looked at his partners, who would not meet his eyes. He looked at the bank man, who was already standing up. He looked at Simone, and Simone was already sliding away from him down the pew, because Simone had come to that church for a rich man, and she was watching that rich man dissolve in front of her in real time. But Nyla was not done, and this was the piece that made Simone gasp out loud, because Nyla turned to that one extra guest she had invited, the one connected to Simone, and she said gently, "You should tell him, or should I?" And the guest stood, and it came out plain and terrible that Simone had never been faithful to Omari at all, that she had been running the same game on Omari's own business partner at the very same time, playing both men, betting on whichever one held the money longest. Simone had picked Omari because she thought he was the richer one, and she had bet wrong. Simone stood up so fast she nearly dropped the baby, and Nyla was there in an instant, taking Elijah smoothly out of her arms, and Simone, exposed in front of the whole church in her red dress with nowhere to hide, did the only thing left to do. She ran. Down the aisle and out the doors, her heels hammering the stone, chased by nothing but the eyes of 200 people who now knew exactly what she was. And Miss Odessa. Nyla saved the last piece for her. She lifted one of the forged documents, the one with the note in the margin, and she held it up so the family could see the round, old-fashioned handwriting. "This is your mother's hand, Omari. She helped write me out, the woman I fed and bathed and sat up with for 2 years. She looked at Odessa, and for the first time her voice softened, not with anger, but with something sadder. "I forgave you a long time ago, Miss Odessa, but everybody in this room just met the real you." Odessa's church hat could not hide her face. The cousins around her pulled away. The queen had no throne left. Nyla picked her gold cross back up off the font, and the light through the stained glass caught the engraving on the back, and for just a second you could read it. "Truth outlives noise." She fastened it around her neck, settled her son on her hip, and she looked at her husband one last time. "You told me to move to the back. I'll do you one better. I'll leave through the front." And she walked out of that church with her head high and her son in her arms, and the whole congregation stood as she passed, not for Omari, but for her. Now, revenge, real revenge, is not something you have to chase. Sometimes you just have to step out of the way and let a man run full speed into the wall he built himself. That is what happened to Omari. By the end of that week, it was all gone. The bank called the forged loans, and since every asset was legally Nyla's, Omari had nothing to put against them. His business partners, humiliated in that church and staring at fraud with their names near it, cut him loose the same day and took the company's real contracts with them. The house was hers, so she simply let him keep the back bedroom for exactly as long as it took him to find somewhere else, and not one day more. The cars went back. The big talk that had carried him his whole life stopped working because word travels, and every room he walked into now already knew what he was. And watch how fast a proud man shrinks once the money's gone. Within a month, Omari was the one making calls that nobody returned. The friends who laughed at his jokes at that dinner party did not answer the phone. The men who used to want a piece of his business now crossed the street when they saw him, because fraud is a smell that sticks to a man, and forgery in a church is a story people tell for years. He moved into a one-room apartment on the far side of town, he who used to stand on a white porch and call his wife plain. He learned real quick what plain looked like when there was no one left to serve him dinner. And the worst part, the part that surely kept him awake at night, was that he had done it himself. Nobody stole anything from Omari. He signed it away with his own hand and then spat on the only person who ever protected him. Simone did not wait around for any of it. The moment she understood there was no money left, she was gone, and not to the business partner either, because he'd heard the truth in that church same as everyone. She had played two men and lost them both in a single afternoon, and the city is not big enough to hide a story like that. And Miss Odessa, the woman who plotted so carefully to replace her daughter-in-law, found herself in the end replaced by no one, because there was no one left who wanted her. The family that watched her handwriting get held up in church did not forget it. She grew old in a small room with a phone that did not ring, and she had all the time in the world to think about the good girl she threw away. Nyla did not do a single thing to make any of that happen. She didn't have to. She just told the truth one time in the right room, and then she stepped back and let their own choices finish the work. Karma does not need our help. It only needs us to get out of its way. She asked for nothing more. No lawsuits for revenge, no interviews, no cruel words. She signed the papers that made official what was already true, packed what mattered, and closed the door on that big house with the white porch, because a house is only a home if there's honesty inside it, and there hadn't been for a long time. Let me show you where she ended up, because this is the part I most want you to remember. Almost a year later, there is a smaller house on a quiet street with a garden out back. It is nothing like the big house. It is better. It is hers. Honestly hers, in the way that matters, and on a warm evening with the sun going gold, Nyla sits on the porch steps, that little cross still at her throat, and she watches her son. Elijah is walking now, wobbly and laughing, chasing something across the grass, and when he sees his mother, he turns and runs to her as fast as his little legs will go, arms wide open, and she catches him and lifts him up into the light, and she laughs, really laughs, the kind of laugh she hadn't had in years. There is no bitterness in her face. She does not spend her evenings thinking about Omari or Simone or Odessa. They cost her enough already. She will not give her peace on top of everything else. She built something small and true, and it is enough, and it is safe, and it is hers. She started her own thing, too, in that year, a small bookkeeping business run from the little office off the kitchen, helping other women in the neighborhood keep their own money in their own names so that no smooth-talking man could ever do to them what was almost done to her. Word got around. The boring housewife who was so good at numbers turned out to be exactly the woman a lot of people needed. She wears her mother's gold cross to every meeting, and sometimes when a client sits across from her, scared and ashamed, sure that being quiet means being weak, Nyla reaches up and touches that cross and tells her the truth, that the calm ones are the strong ones, that patience is not the same as surrender, that a woman who knows her worth is holding more power than the loudest man in any room, and she just has to wait for the right moment to set it down on the table. They say Omari drove past that street once, months after everything fell apart, sat in a borrowed car and watched from a distance as the woman he called boring and plain lifted their laughing son into a golden evening on a porch he could never afford again. And whatever he felt in that moment, watching all that warmth he threw away, he had to sit in it alone, because you cannot point your finger at the truth and expect it to disappear. The truth just waits, and then it outlives you. So here is what Nyla's story leaves us with. The loudest person in the room is almost never the strongest. Real power doesn't shout, it doesn't beg, it doesn't need everyone to see it coming. It waits, calm and certain, holding on to what it knows until the right moment arrives. Dignity is not weakness, silence is not surrender, and a woman who knows her own worth cannot be humiliated by a man who never understood it. If you've ever been counted out, talked down to, replaced, and asked to just accept it quietly, I want you to remember Nyla walking out of that church through the front door with her head high. She did not win because she was cruel. She won because she was patient, because she paid attention, and because she never once forgot who she was, even when the people closest to her tried to make her forget. That is a kind of strength no one can take from you, and no one can fake. Your day is coming too. Truth outlives noise. It always has. If this story moved something in you, stay a while and share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and keep watching, because there are more stories like hers waiting for you. Stories about quiet people who were underestimated one too many times. Let her remind you what dignity really looks like.